Deep in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, where the morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines like forgotten prayers, there exists a silence that older residents refuse to break. It's not the comfortable quiet of mountain solitude. It's the deliberate, calculated silence of people who've learned that some stories are better left buried beneath layers of time and mountain stone. When you mention certain names in the right company, conversations halt mid-sentence, eyes dart toward windows, and suddenly everyone remembers urgent business elsewhere. This isn't about the usual mountain folklore that tourists love to hear around campfires. This isn't about moonshine runners or feuding clans that make for colorful local history. What I'm about to share with you involves a family whose very existence has been systematically erased from public records, whose practices were so disturbing that even seasoned investigators walked away rather than document what they'd witnessed. A bloodline that, according to those brave enough to whisper about it, never truly disappeared. They simply learned to hide better. The story I'm going to tell you spans generations, involves missing persons cases that were quietly closed without resolution, and centers around rituals that challenge everything we think we know about the isolated communities tucked away in America's most remote mountains. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why mention of this particular family name can still clear a room in certain parts of Appalachia, and why some local historians have refused to include their story in any official documentation. But before we descend into the darkness of what really happened in those forgotten valleys, I need you to understand something crucial about the nature of secrets in mountain communities. These aren't people who scare easily. Generations of Appalachian families have survived everything from harsh winters that could trap them for months to economic hardships that would break most communities. They've dealt with dangerous wildlife, treacherous terrain, and the kind of isolation that breeds both incredible self-reliance and unshakable bonds between neighbors. So when people who've lived their entire lives in these mountains, people whose great-grandparents carved homesteads from virgin forest, and whose children still hunt the same ridges, when these people refuse to speak about something, when they change the subject or claim ignorance about events their neighbors swear they witnessed, you can be certain that whatever they're protecting themselves from is far worse than anything the outside world might throw at them. The family at the center of this story understood that silence was their greatest protection. They cultivated it deliberately, ensuring that anyone who might have spoken about their activities either disappeared entirely or learned very quickly that discretion was the only path to survival. They didn't just practice their traditions in secret, they made certain that the very knowledge of those traditions became a liability for anyone who possessed it. What makes this case particularly unsettling is how recent some of these events actually are. We're not talking about colonial-era witch trials or 19th century folklore. The last confirmed activity involving this family occurred within the lifetime of people who are still alive today, still living in the same communities, still maintaining the same careful silence that has protected them for decades. Cell phone towers may have finally reached some of these remote valleys, but the old agreements about what can and cannot be discussed remain as binding as ever. The investigation that brought this story to light began not with some academic researcher or true crime enthusiast, but with a routine property survey in the summer of 2019. A team of surveyors working for a natural gas company was mapping potential pipeline routes through a section of the Daniel Boone National Forest when they discovered something that shouldn't have existed according to any official records. A cluster of structures hidden so deep in a hollow that they weren't visible from any existing trail or road. These weren't the typical abandoned homesteads that dot the Appalachian landscape. The buildings were maintained, recently occupied, and arranged in a pattern that suggested careful planning rather than the organic growth of a typical mountain settlement. More disturbing was what the surveyors found inside the largest structure, a rotom that had been deliberately sealed from the inside, containing objects and materials that defied easy explanation. The surveyor who made the initial discovery, a man named Marcus Webb, who'd spent 15 years mapping remote areas throughout eastern Kentucky, described the scene in his report as unlike anything he'd encountered in his career. Webb was no stranger to the abandoned mines, forgotten cemeteries, and crumbling cabins that pepper the region. But what he found in that sealed room convinced him that some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. Within 48 hours of filing his report, Webb received a visit from individuals who identified themselves as representatives of a private security firm. They confiscated his equipment, seized his documentation, and made it clear that any further discussion of his findings would result in consequences that extended far beyond the loss of his job. Webb's employer, a company that had been operating in the region for over a decade, immediately canceled the survey project and reassigned their team to a different state. But Webb's discovery had already set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the truth about the family that locals had spent generations learning not to mention. The sealed room contained evidence of practices that had been continuing uninterrupted for over a century, maintained by a bloodline that had perfected the art of existing just beyond the reach of official scrutiny. The artifacts Webb documented before his equipment was confiscated included items that suggested a level of organization and long-term planning that contradicted everything authorities thought they knew about isolated mountain communities. So these weren't the random accumulations of a single generation. They were carefully preserved collections that had been maintained and added to over decades, possibly longer. More troubling was the evidence that suggested this wasn't an abandoned site at all. The structures showed signs of recent occupation, and the sealed room appeared to have been secured not to preserve historical artifacts, but to protect active materials from discovery. Webb's photographs, which he managed to transmit to colleagues before his equipment was confiscated, showed arrangements that implied ongoing use rather than historical preservation. The family responsible for maintaining this site had managed to operate for generations without appearing in census records, without holding property deeds in their own names, and without leaving any of the typical documentary evidence that follows most American families through history. They existed in the spaces between official records, maintaining their traditions and practices in locations that weren't supposed to exist according to any government map. Understanding how they achieved this level of invisibility requires understanding the unique geography and history of eastern Kentucky. The region is characterized by thousands of small hollows and hidden valleys that have never been fully mapped or explored by outside authorities. During the coal boom of the early 20th century, many of these remote areas were overlooked by mining companies focused on more accessible deposits. Later, when various government agencies began systematic surveys of the region, certain areas were mysteriously excluded from official documentation. Local residents who've spent their entire lives in these mountains speak of valleys that don't appear on any map, of trails that seem to shift location between visits, and of landmarks that can only be found by those who already know exactly where to look. Whether these phenomena result from natural geographic features or more deliberate human intervention is a question that few are willing to explore too deeply. The family that Webb inadvertently discovered had chosen their location with careful consideration of these geographic advantages. Their settlement existed in a hollow that was accessible only through a series of narrow passages that could easily be blocked or concealed. The approach required intimate knowledge of the terrain, and even with that knowledge, reaching the site involved a journey that could take hours through terrain that would challenge experienced hikers. This isolation wasn't accidental. Historical records suggest that the family had been planning their withdrawal from mainstream society for generations, carefully selecting and preparing their final location over decades before making the complete transition to invisibility. They understood that true security required more than just physical remoteness. It demanded complete disconnection from the systems that modern society uses to track and monitor its members. The process of achieving this disconnection involved sacrifices that most families would find unthinkable. Children born into the family after their withdrawal never appeared in birth records, never attended schools, never received medical care from outside providers. They were raised entirely within the confines of their isolated community, educated according to traditions that had been maintained within the family for generations. This educational system focused not on preparing children for life in the outside world, but on ensuring the continuation of practices and knowledge that the family considered essential to their survival. Children learned skills that had been passed down through generations, participated in rituals that reinforced their separation from mainstream society, and absorbed beliefs that made integration with the outside world not just difficult, but spiritually dangerous. The family's commitment to this isolation was so complete that they developed their own methods for obtaining supplies and materials that couldn't be produced within their community. These methods involved carefully cultivated relationships with individuals who lived at the margins of mainstream society, people who understood the value of discretion and who had their own reasons for avoiding official scrutiny. These supply networks operated according to principles that had been refined over generations. Transactions were conducted through intermediaries who never knew the full extent of what they were facilitating. Payments were made in forms that couldn't be easily traced. And most importantly, everyone involved understood that their continued prosperity depended on maintaining absolute silence about the nature of their business relationships. The family's ability to maintain these networks while remaining completely invisible to outside authorities demonstrates a level of operational sophistication that challenges common assumptions about isolated mountain communities. They weren't simply hiding in the wilderness. They were operating a complex system that allowed them to maintain their traditional practices while adapting to the changing world around them. This system had been tested and refined through generations of practice. The family had survived the Civil War, the industrialization of Appalachia, the Great Depression, and the social upheavals of the 20th century without ever compromising their core practices or revealing their location to unwanted observers. They had learned to bend without breaking, to adapt without surrendering the essential elements of their identity. But Webb's accidental discovery represented a new kind of threat, one that their traditional methods of maintaining secrecy might not be adequate to address. For the first time in generations, physical evidence of their existence had been documented by someone outside their carefully controlled network of contacts. The sealed room that Webb had photographed contained materials that could potentially expose not just their current activities, but the full scope of practices that had been maintained in secret for over a century. The response to Webb's discovery was swift and comprehensive, but it also revealed the extent of the family's influence and the sophistication of their protective measures. The individuals who confiscated Webb's equipment and documentation weren't operating as vigilantes or local enforcers. They were part of a professional organization that had been specifically contracted to handle exactly this type of situation. This suggests that the family's isolation wasn't as complete as it appeared. They maintained connections to resources and capabilities that extended far beyond their remote mountain hollow. They had planned for the possibility of discovery and had prepared responses that could be implemented quickly and effectively when necessary. The speed and efficiency of their response also suggests that Webb's discovery wasn't the first time they'd been forced to address outside intrusion. The family had likely developed their protective protocols through experience, refining their methods over generations of practice. They knew exactly what needed to be done to contain the threat and ensure that their secrets remained protected. But containing Webb's discovery was only the beginning of the challenge they faced. The artifacts and materials he documented before his equipment was confiscated provided clues that could potentially be followed by others. The family's long-term security now depended on ensuring that no one else would be motivated to pursue those clues or ask the questions that Webb's discovery had raised. This is where the true power of their protective network became apparent. Within weeks of Webb's discovery, the natural gas company that had commissioned the survey announced that they were abandoning their pipeline project in that region entirely. The official explanation cited environmental concerns and regulatory complications, but industry insiders noted that the company had already invested millions in preliminary work and had previously expressed confidence about the project's viability. The abandonment of the pipeline project eliminated the immediate threat of further surveying in the area, but it also demonstrated the family's ability to influence decisions at a corporate level. Someone with significant resources and connections had intervened to ensure that the region would remain undisturbed. This level of influence suggested that the family's protective network extended far beyond the mountains of eastern Kentucky. As we'll explore in the next part of this investigation, the family's ability to maintain their secrets while wielding this kind of influence raises disturbing questions about the true scope of their activities and the extent of their connections to the outside world. The story of their origins, their practices, and their methods of maintaining control over their territory reveals a pattern of behavior that challenges everything we thought we knew about isolated communities in modern America. The sealed room that Webb discovered was just the beginning of a much larger and more complex story, one that involves generations of carefully maintained traditions, systematic elimination of potential threats, and practices that have continued uninterrupted in the hidden valleys of Appalachia for over a century. The sealed room that Webb discovered contained more than just artifacts. It held the key to understanding how a family could maintain such elaborate secrecy while simultaneously wielding influence that reached into corporate boardrooms and government agencies. The objects Webb photographed in those final moments before his equipment was confiscated told a story that extended far beyond the boundaries of their mountain hollow. Among the most disturbing items were detailed records spanning multiple generations, meticulously maintained in a series of leather-bound journals that appeared to chronicle not just the family's activities, but their interactions with the outside world. These weren't the simple record-keeping efforts of an isolated community. They were sophisticated intelligence files that tracked individuals, organizations, and events across decades of careful observation. The journals contained names, dates, and locations that suggested the family had been monitoring developments throughout the broader region with the precision of a professional intelligence operation. They had documented the movements of law enforcement officials, the activities of researchers and academics who had shown interest in local history, and the business dealings of companies that might potentially threaten their security. More unsettling were the entries that described what the family referred to as interventions, detailed accounts of actions taken to eliminate threats or redirect attention away from their territory. These interventions ranged from subtle economic pressure applied through intermediaries to more direct forms of persuasion that the journal writers described in language that was both euphemistic and chilling. The family had developed a comprehensive understanding of how power operates in rural communities, recognizing that true influence comes not from official positions, but from the ability to affect the decisions of those who hold such positions. They had identified key individuals whose cooperation was essential to their continued security and had developed methods for ensuring that cooperation remained reliable over time. These methods involved a combination of financial incentives, personal favors, and carefully applied pressure that created networks of obligation extending throughout the region. Local officials, business leaders, and community influencers found themselves indebted to the family in ways that made resistance both difficult and dangerous. The system they had created was self-reinforcing. Each successful intervention strengthened their position and expanded their influence, while also creating new sources of information about potential threats. Their network of contacts and informants grew organically as people recognized the benefits of cooperation and the risks of opposition. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Webb's discovery was the evidence suggesting that the family's influence extended beyond their immediate region. The journals contained references to contacts and activities in distant cities, suggesting that their network had evolved into something approaching a national organization with resources and capabilities that far exceeded what might be expected from an isolated mountain community. This expansion had occurred gradually over several generations, with each succeeding generation building upon the foundation established by their predecessors. The family had learned to identify opportunities for extending their influence and had developed strategies for establishing footholds in new territories without compromising their core security. The process involved careful selection of individuals who could serve as intermediaries and representatives in distant locations. These individuals were chosen not just for their capabilities, but for their vulnerabilities, personal or professional circumstances that made them susceptible to the family's particular forms of persuasion. Once established, these distant connections provided both intelligence and operational capabilities that enhanced the family's ability to protect their interests. They could monitor developments in government agencies, academic institutions, and corporate environments that might eventually affect their security. They could also take preemptive action to prevent potential threats from developing into actual dangers. The sophistication of this network became apparent in the response to Webb's discovery. The individuals who confiscated his equipment and documentation weren't local mountain residents. They were professionals who had been positioned in advance to handle exactly this type of situation. They arrived with proper credentials, followed established protocols, and operated with the efficiency of people who had extensive experience managing similar incidents. This suggests that the family had anticipated the possibility of accidental discovery and had prepared comprehensive contingency plans for dealing with such situations. They had invested in professional security services, established relationships with organizations that could provide rapid response capabilities, and created cover stories that would satisfy official inquiries without revealing the true nature of their activities. The speed and effectiveness of their response also indicates that they had been monitoring the surveying activities from the beginning. They knew about Webb's work before he made his discovery, and they were prepared to act immediately when the situation required their intervention. This level of surveillance and preparation suggests operational capabilities that extend far beyond what most people would associate with an isolated mountain family. But their ability to monitor and respond to external threats was only one aspect of their sophisticated protective system. The family had also developed methods for ensuring internal security that were equally comprehensive and effective. They understood that their greatest vulnerability came not from outside discovery, but from the possibility that someone within their own community might compromise their security. The methods they used to maintain internal discipline involved a combination of cultural indoctrination, economic dependence, and psychological manipulation that created bonds of loyalty that were extremely difficult to break. Children were raised from birth to understand that their survival depended on maintaining absolute secrecy about their family's activities. This indoctrination process involved more than simple instruction. It included participation in rituals and practices that created deep emotional and psychological connections to the family's traditions. Children learned that their identity was inseparable from their role in maintaining the family's security, and that any betrayal of that trust would result in consequences that extended far beyond personal punishment. The family also understood that economic dependence was crucial to maintaining control over their members. They had structured their community so that individuals had no viable alternatives to continued participation in the family's activities. Members who might have considered leaving found themselves without the resources, connections, or skills necessary to survive in the outside world. This economic control was reinforced by the family's network of external contacts, who were instructed to report any attempts by family members to establish independent relationships or seek outside assistance. The family's influence in the broader community made it nearly impossible for members to escape their control without facing severe consequences. The psychological aspects of their control system were perhaps the most effective. The family had developed methods for creating deep-seated fears and anxieties that made independent action almost impossible for most members. They understood that true control came not from external pressure, but from internal conviction that resistance was both futile and dangerous. These psychological techniques involved a combination of isolation, indoctrination, and carefully orchestrated experiences that reinforced the family's narrative about the dangers of the outside world and the necessity of maintaining absolute loyalty to the family's traditions. Members learned to police their own thoughts and behaviors, understanding that even private doubts could be detected and punished. The effectiveness of these control mechanisms became apparent in the aftermath of Webb's discovery. Despite the potential disruption to their security, there were no reports of family members attempting to leave or seek outside assistance. The family maintained complete internal discipline while simultaneously managing the external threat, demonstrating the sophistication of their organizational structure. This organizational sophistication extended to their methods for maintaining their traditional practices while adapting to changing circumstances. The family had developed systems for preserving essential knowledge and skills across generations while also evolving their techniques to address new challenges and opportunities. The sealed room that Webb discovered contained evidence of this evolutionary process. The materials he photographed showed how the family had adapted their practices to incorporate modern technology and resources while maintaining the essential elements of their traditional system. They had learned to use contemporary tools and methods to enhance their traditional capabilities without compromising their core identity. This adaptation process had been ongoing for generations, with each succeeding generation building upon the innovations of their predecessors while also developing new solutions to emerging challenges. The family had learned to balance tradition with innovation, maintaining continuity while also ensuring their continued effectiveness in a changing world. The result was a hybrid system that combined ancient practices with modern capabilities, creating an organization that was both deeply rooted in tradition and highly effective in contemporary environments. They had achieved a level of integration between old and new that allowed them to maintain their essential identity while also developing the capabilities necessary to protect their interests in an increasingly complex world. But this integration came at a cost that became apparent in the materials Webb documented. The family's traditional practices had evolved in ways that made them increasingly dangerous to both their members and the broader community. The combination of ancient rituals with modern resources had created capabilities that exceeded anything their ancestors might have imagined. The journals Webb photographed contained descriptions of practices that had been refined and enhanced over generations of experimentation. What had begun as traditional mountain customs had evolved into something far more sophisticated and potentially dangerous. The family had learned to use their ancestral knowledge as a foundation for developing new methods that were both more effective and more disturbing than anything their predecessors had practiced. This evolution had occurred gradually, with each generation adding new elements to their traditional practices while maintaining the essential structure that had been passed down through their ancestors. The result was a system that appeared traditional on the surface, but incorporated capabilities that were distinctly modern in their scope and effectiveness. The family's ability to maintain this evolutionary process while preserving their security demonstrates a level of organizational sophistication that challenges common assumptions about isolated communities. They had created a system that was both stable and adaptable, capable of preserving essential traditions while also developing new capabilities as circumstances required. This sophistication became crucial to their survival as the modern world increasingly encroached upon their territory. The family had recognized that simple isolation was no longer sufficient protection against the capabilities of contemporary surveillance and investigation. They needed to develop more sophisticated methods for maintaining their security while also preserving their traditional practices. The response to Webb's discovery demonstrated how successfully they had adapted to these new challenges. Their ability to neutralize the threat while maintaining their security showed that they had developed capabilities that were equal to the challenges of operating in a modern surveillance environment. Their success in handling Webb's discovery revealed something even more disturbing about their organizational structure. The family had developed what could only be described as a parallel intelligence network that operated alongside but separate from any official law enforcement or government agency. This network possessed capabilities that in many ways exceeded those of traditional authorities, particularly in their ability to gather information and influence events without leaving any official trail. The sophistication of this intelligence operation became apparent through the documents Webb managed to photograph before his equipment was confiscated. These materials revealed a systematic approach to information gathering that had been refined over decades of practice. The family had developed methods for infiltrating organizations, monitoring communications, and tracking individuals that demonstrated a level of professional competence that would be impressive even by government standards. Their information gathering wasn't limited to passive observation. The family had developed active intelligence operations that involved placing their members or associates in positions where they could directly influence events. These operations were planned and executed with the precision of professional intelligence services, complete with backup plans and contingency protocols for dealing with unexpected complications. The placement of their operatives followed patterns that suggested careful long-term planning. Rather than seeking obvious positions of power, they focused on roles that provided access to information and decision-making processes without attracting attention. They understood that true influence often came from positions that appeared mundane but provided crucial access to information and resources. These positions included clerical roles in government offices, maintenance jobs in corporate facilities, and service positions in organizations that handled sensitive information. The family had learned that people in these roles were often overlooked by security protocols while having access to information that could be extremely valuable for intelligence purposes. The effectiveness of this approach became apparent in their ability to anticipate and counter potential threats before they could develop into serious problems. The family's intelligence network provided early warning about investigations, research projects, and business activities that might eventually affect their security. This advance warning allowed them to take preemptive action that prevented most threats from ever becoming serious challenges. Their preemptive actions followed established patterns that had been refined through generations of experience. When faced with potential threats, the family would first attempt to redirect attention away from their territory through subtle manipulation of circumstances and information. If redirection proved insufficient, they would escalate to more direct forms of intervention that eliminated the threat while maintaining their security. The escalation process was carefully structured to minimize exposure while maximizing effectiveness. Each level of intervention involved different resources and capabilities, allowing the family to match their response to the specific nature of the threat they faced. This structured approach ensured that they never used more force than necessary, while also guaranteeing that serious threats would be eliminated completely. The family's ability to maintain this level of operational sophistication while remaining completely invisible to official scrutiny demonstrates capabilities that extend far beyond what most people would expect from an isolated mountain community. They had created an organization that operated with the efficiency of a professional intelligence service while maintaining the cohesion and loyalty of a traditional family structure. This combination of professional capabilities with traditional loyalty created an organization that was both highly effective and extremely difficult to penetrate or disrupt. The family bonds that held the organization together were reinforced by shared participation in practices that created deep emotional and psychological connections between members. These connections made betrayal not just dangerous, but psychologically difficult for most members to contemplate. The practices that created these bonds involved rituals and ceremonies that had been refined over generations to maximize their psychological impact. These weren't simple cultural traditions. They were sophisticated psychological techniques designed to create specific emotional states and behavioral patterns that reinforced loyalty to the family's objectives. The psychological effectiveness of these practices became apparent in the complete absence of defectors or informants, despite the family's extensive operations over multiple generations. Even when individual members might have had personal reasons for questioning the family's activities, the psychological conditioning they had undergone made independent action extremely difficult. This psychological control was reinforced by the family's understanding of how to create and maintain states of dependency that made resistance both difficult and dangerous. Members learned that their survival depended not just on maintaining loyalty to the family, but on actively participating in the systems that maintained the family's security and power. The participation requirements weren't simply passive. They involved active engagement in activities that created personal investment in the family's continued success. Members weren't just expected to maintain secrecy about the family's activities. They were required to participate in operations that made them complicit in the family's methods and objectives. This complicity created additional barriers to defection by ensuring that any member who might consider leaving would face serious personal consequences from their own participation in the family's activities. The family had structured their operations so that betrayal would result in self-incrimination, making resistance both personally dangerous and legally problematic. The legal implications of this structure became apparent in the aftermath of Webb's discovery. Despite the potential evidence of illegal activities, no law enforcement agency initiated any investigation into the family's operations. This absence of official response suggests that the family's protective network included individuals within law enforcement and government agencies who were positioned to prevent or redirect investigations. The family's ability to influence official responses demonstrated the extent of their penetration into legitimate institutions. They had developed relationships with individuals who could affect the decisions of law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and other government organizations that might otherwise investigate their activities. These relationships weren't simply matters of corruption or bribery. They involved more sophisticated forms of influence that created long-term obligations and dependencies. The family had learned to identify individuals whose personal or professional circumstances made them vulnerable to various forms of persuasion, and they had developed methods for exploiting these vulnerabilities to create lasting relationships of mutual benefit. The mutual benefit aspect was crucial to the sustainability of these relationships. Rather than simply demanding cooperation, the family provided valuable services and resources that made their partners genuinely invested in maintaining the relationship. This approach created networks of cooperation that were both more reliable and more difficult to detect than traditional corruption. The services the family provided to their partners included intelligence about competitors and rivals, advance warning about regulatory or legal challenges, and access to resources that were difficult to obtain through official channels. These services were valuable enough that recipients had strong incentives to maintain their relationships with the family, even when those relationships involved some degree of risk. The family's ability to provide these services demonstrated capabilities that extended far beyond their immediate territory. They had developed sources of information and resources that allowed them to influence events across broad geographic areas and multiple sectors of society. This influence was exercised through their network of contacts and intermediaries, creating a system of indirect control that was both effective and difficult to trace. The indirect nature of their control was essential to their security. By avoiding direct involvement in activities that might attract official attention, the family could influence events while maintaining plausible deniability about their role in those events. This approach allowed them to exercise significant power while remaining officially invisible. The invisibility they maintained wasn't simply a matter of avoiding publicity. It involved systematic efforts to remove or alter records that might document their activities. The family had developed capabilities for manipulating information systems that allowed them to control what information was available to potential investigators. These capabilities included both technical methods for altering electronic records and human networks for influencing the creation and maintenance of official documentation. The family understood that controlling information was crucial to maintaining their security, and they had invested heavily in developing the capabilities necessary to manage information flow effectively. The effectiveness of their information control became apparent in the response to Webb's discovery. Within days of his initial report, official records of the surveying project had been altered to remove references to the areas where he had made his discovery. The natural gas company's documentation was modified to suggest that the project had been abandoned for routine business reasons rather than because of any specific discovery. This systematic alteration of records demonstrated capabilities that would be impressive even for government intelligence agencies. The family had developed methods for accessing and modifying information systems that suggested either extensive technical expertise or access to individuals with such expertise within legitimate organizations. The technical capabilities they possessed were complemented by human networks that could influence the creation and maintenance of official records. The family had developed relationships with individuals in positions where they could affect what information was recorded and how it was preserved. These relationships allowed them to exercise subtle but effective control over the documentary evidence of their activities. The combination of technical and human capabilities created a comprehensive system for managing information that was both proactive and reactive. The family could prevent problematic information from being recorded in the first place, and they could also modify or eliminate records that had already been created when circumstances required such action. This information management system was crucial to their long-term security because it allowed them to maintain their invisibility even when their activities might otherwise leave traces that could be followed by investigators. The family understood that modern investigations relied heavily on documentary evidence, and they had developed the capabilities necessary to control that evidence effectively. Their success in managing information about their activities was demonstrated by the complete absence of official documentation about their existence, despite their extensive operations over multiple generations. The family had managed to operate a sophisticated organization while leaving virtually no trace in the official records that investigators would normally use to document such activities. This absence of documentation wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate and systematic efforts to control information flow over extended periods. The family had recognized that their long-term security depended on their ability to remain invisible to official scrutiny, and they had developed the capabilities necessary to maintain that invisibility even as their operations expanded and evolved. The expansion of their operations had occurred gradually over several generations, with each succeeding generation building upon the foundation established by their predecessors, while also developing new capabilities and extending their influence into new areas. This evolutionary process had been carefully managed to avoid attracting attention while steadily increasing their power and security. The management of this evolutionary process required sophisticated planning and coordination capabilities that demonstrated the family's organizational maturity. They had learned to balance growth with security, expanding their influence while maintaining the secrecy that was essential to their survival. This balance required careful attention to both opportunities and risks, ensuring that each expansion enhanced rather than compromised their overall security. The family's ability to maintain this balance while operating across multiple generations demonstrates organizational capabilities that are remarkable by any standard. They had created a system that was both stable and adaptable, capable of preserving essential traditions while also evolving to meet new challenges and opportunities. This evolutionary capability became crucial as the modern world increasingly encroached upon their traditional territory. The family had recognized that simple isolation was no longer sufficient protection against contemporary surveillance and investigation capabilities. They needed to develop more sophisticated methods for maintaining their security while also preserving their traditional practices and expanding their influence. The solution they developed involved creating multiple layers of protection that operated simultaneously to provide comprehensive security. These layers included physical security measures, information management systems, network-based influence operations, and psychological control mechanisms that worked together to create a defensive system that was both redundant and mutually reinforcing. The redundancy of their security system meant that the failure of any single protective measure wouldn't compromise their overall security. The family had learned from experience that even the most sophisticated security systems could be penetrated or disrupted, and they had developed backup systems that could maintain their protection even when primary systems failed. The mutual reinforcement between different security layers created a system that was stronger than the sum of its parts. Each layer enhanced the effectiveness of the others, creating synergistic effects that made the overall system much more difficult to penetrate or disrupt than any single protective measure could have been. This comprehensive approach to security reflected the family's understanding that their survival depended on their ability to adapt to an increasingly complex and challenging environment. They had recognized that the old methods of maintaining secrecy through simple isolation were no longer adequate, and they had developed new approaches that were appropriate for operating in a modern surveillance environment. The success of their adapted security system was demonstrated by their ability to neutralize the threat posed by Webb's discovery while maintaining their operational security. Despite the potential for significant disruption, the family had managed to contain the threat and eliminate the evidence while preserving their ability to continue their traditional practices. This success suggests that the family's evolutionary process had been effective in developing capabilities that were adequate for dealing with contemporary challenges. They had managed to preserve their essential identity while also developing the sophisticated capabilities necessary to operate effectively in a modern environment. But the very sophistication of their adapted system raises disturbing questions about what they might be capable of accomplishing with such resources and capabilities. The family had developed an organization that combined traditional practices with modern capabilities in ways that created potential for activities that their ancestors could never have imagined. The true scope of these capabilities only became apparent when researchers began investigating the patterns of disappearances that had occurred in the region over the past several decades. What they discovered was a systematic approach to eliminating threats that demonstrated planning and coordination extending far beyond what anyone had previously suspected. The disappearances weren't random events. They followed specific patterns that suggested careful selection and timing. Individuals who had shown interest in local history, researchers who had asked too many questions about certain families, and investigators who had ventured too close to restricted areas all shared certain characteristics that made them particularly vulnerable to the family's attention. The selection process appeared to involve extensive background research on potential targets. The family had developed methods for identifying individuals whose disappearance would attract minimal official attention, people who lived alone, who had few close relationships, or whose work involved traveling to remote areas where accidents might seem plausible. The timing of these disappearances was equally systematic. They occurred during periods when official attention was focused elsewhere, when weather conditions made search and rescue operations difficult, or when other events provided convenient explanations for why someone might have vanished without a trace. The family's ability to coordinate these activities across extended periods demonstrates organizational capabilities that are disturbing in their sophistication. They had developed systems for monitoring potential threats, assessing vulnerabilities, and executing elimination operations that left no evidence linking the disappearances to their activities. The execution methods varied according to circumstances, but they shared common characteristics that suggested professional training and experience. The family had learned techniques for making disappearances appear accidental, for eliminating physical evidence, and for creating false trails that would mislead investigators who might otherwise discover the truth. These techniques weren't improvised. They were the result of generations of refinement and improvement. The family had developed what could only be described as a professional approach to elimination operations, complete with protocols for different types of threats and contingency plans for dealing with unexpected complications. The professional nature of their operations became apparent through analysis of the few cases where investigators had managed to gather significant evidence before the trails went cold. These cases revealed patterns of evidence manipulation and misdirection that demonstrated extensive knowledge of investigative procedures and evidence analysis techniques. The family understood how investigators worked, what types of evidence they would look for, and how to manipulate or eliminate that evidence in ways that would make successful investigation impossible. This knowledge wasn't theoretical, it was practical expertise that had been developed through direct experience with investigative procedures. This practical expertise suggests that the family had either recruited individuals with professional law enforcement or investigative backgrounds, or they had developed their own training programs for teaching these skills to family members. Either possibility represents a level of organizational sophistication that challenges common assumptions about isolated rural communities. The recruitment possibility is particularly disturbing because it suggests that the family's influence extended into professional law enforcement organizations. If they had succeeded in recruiting individuals with official investigative authority, their ability to manipulate investigations and control evidence would be virtually unlimited. The alternative possibility that they had developed their own training programs suggests an even more systematic approach to building capabilities. The family would have needed to identify the specific skills and knowledge required for their operations, develop methods for teaching those skills, and create systems for maintaining and improving their capabilities over time. Either scenario indicates that the family had recognized the importance of professional level capabilities and had invested the resources necessary to develop or acquire those capabilities. This investment demonstrates long-term strategic thinking and planning that extends far beyond the immediate needs of protecting their traditional practices. The strategic nature of their planning became apparent through analysis of how their operations had evolved over time. Rather than simply reacting to threats as they emerged, the family had developed proactive approaches that prevented threats from developing into serious problems. This proactive approach required the ability to anticipate future challenges and prepare responses in advance. The anticipation of future challenges involved sophisticated analysis of trends and developments that might eventually affect their security. The family had developed intelligence capabilities that allowed them to monitor changes in technology, law enforcement procedures, and social attitudes that might create new vulnerabilities or opportunities. This monitoring wasn't casual observation. It involved systematic collection and analysis of information from multiple sources. The family had developed what could only be described as a strategic intelligence operation that provided early warning about developments that might require changes in their procedures or capabilities. The early warning capability was crucial to their continued success because it allowed them to adapt their operations before new threats could become serious problems. The family understood that reactive responses were often insufficient for dealing with sophisticated threats, and they had invested in developing the capabilities necessary for proactive defense. The proactive defense approach involved multiple layers of activity designed to prevent threats from developing in the first place. These layers included influence operations designed to redirect attention away from their territory, information campaigns designed to discredit potential investigators, and elimination operations designed to remove threats that couldn't be neutralized through other means. The integration of these different approaches required sophisticated coordination and planning capabilities. The family had developed systems for managing multiple simultaneous operations while maintaining operational security and avoiding conflicts between different activities. The coordination requirements were particularly challenging because the family's operations extended across broad geographic areas and involved multiple types of activities. They needed to ensure that their influence operations didn't interfere with their elimination activities, that their information campaigns didn't create vulnerabilities for their other operations, and that their overall activities remained consistent with their long-term strategic objectives. The strategic objectives that guided their operations had evolved over time as the family's capabilities and circumstances changed. What had begun as simple protection of their traditional practices had expanded into a comprehensive program for maintaining and extending their influence across multiple sectors of society. This expansion of objectives reflected the family's recognition that their long-term security required more than passive defense. They had learned that truly effective security required the ability to shape the environment in which they operated, influencing events and decisions in ways that prevented threats from developing in the first place. The environmental shaping activities involved subtle but systematic efforts to influence the attitudes and behaviors of individuals and organizations that might potentially affect their security. These efforts were designed to create conditions that were favorable to the family's interests while appearing to be the result of natural social and economic processes. The natural appearance of these influences was crucial to their effectiveness. The family understood that obvious manipulation would create suspicion and resistance, while subtle influence that appeared to be the result of normal social processes would be accepted without question. The subtlety of their influence operations required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The family had developed expertise in identifying the factors that influenced individual and group behavior, and they had learned to manipulate those factors in ways that produced desired outcomes while avoiding detection. This psychological expertise extended to their methods for controlling their own members and maintaining internal security. The family had developed techniques for creating psychological states that made resistance to their authority both difficult and dangerous for individual members. The psychological control techniques involved combinations of isolation, indoctrination, and carefully orchestrated experiences that created deep emotional and psychological dependencies. Members learned that their identity and survival were inseparable from their loyalty to the family's objectives, making independent action both psychologically difficult and practically dangerous. The practical dangers of independent action were real and immediate. The family had developed systems for detecting and responding to signs of disloyalty that ensured that potential defectors would face severe consequences before they could compromise the family's security. These detection systems involved continuous monitoring of member behavior, thoughts, and communications. The family had created an environment where privacy was impossible and where any sign of questioning or resistance would be immediately identified and addressed. The addressing of disloyalty involved escalating responses that began with psychological pressure and could ultimately involve physical elimination if other methods proved insufficient. The family understood that maintaining internal security required absolute commitment to preventing any breach of their protective systems. The absolute nature of their commitment to security created an organizational culture that was both highly effective and extremely dangerous. Members learned that the family's survival justified any action that might be necessary to protect their interests, and that individual considerations were always subordinate to collective security. This organizational culture produced individuals who were capable of extraordinary dedication and effectiveness in pursuing the family's objectives. Members developed skills and capabilities that would be remarkable in any context, but they were also conditioned to use those capabilities in ways that served the family's interests regardless of external moral or legal considerations. The conditioning process involved systematic exposure to increasingly extreme situations that gradually normalized behaviors that most people would find disturbing or unacceptable. Members learned to view their activities as necessary and justified, regardless of their impact on individuals or communities outside the family. This normalization of extreme behavior was reinforced by the family's narrative about their role in protecting traditional values and practices from the corrupting influences of modern society. Members were taught that their activities were part of a larger struggle to preserve something valuable and sacred that would otherwise be lost. The preservation narrative provided psychological justification for activities that might otherwise create cognitive dissonance or moral conflict. Members could maintain their sense of righteousness and purpose while participating in activities that served the family's practical interests. The practical interests served by their activities extended far beyond simple survival or protection. The family had developed objectives that involved accumulating power and influence for its own sake, creating capabilities that exceeded what would be necessary for purely defensive purposes. This accumulation of power appeared to be driven by a combination of pragmatic considerations and deeper psychological needs. The family had learned that true security required not just the ability to defend against threats, but the capability to control the environment in which those threats might develop. The environmental control they sought involved influence over economic, political, and social systems that might affect their interests. The family had developed capabilities for affecting decisions in corporate boardrooms, government agencies, and community organizations throughout their region of influence. The regional influence they had established provided a foundation for broader expansion that was already underway when Webb made his discovery. The family had begun extending their operations into new geographic areas and new sectors of activity, following patterns that suggested systematic planning for national-level influence. The national expansion involved establishing networks of contacts and capabilities in major metropolitan areas, creating the infrastructure necessary for influencing events at the federal level. The family had recognized that their long-term security required the ability to affect national policies and decisions that might eventually impact their regional operations. The federal influence they were developing involved relationships with individuals in key government agencies, major corporations, and influential organizations. These relationships followed the same patterns that had proven successful in their regional operations, involving carefully cultivated dependencies and mutual benefit arrangements. The mutual benefit arrangements were structured to provide valuable services to federal contacts while creating obligations that served the family's interests. These arrangements were designed to be sustainable over long periods, creating lasting relationships rather than temporary transactions. The sustainability of these relationships required continuous investment in maintaining and expanding the services the family could provide to their federal contacts. They had developed capabilities for gathering intelligence, influencing decisions, and providing resources that were valuable enough to justify the risks involved in maintaining relationships with the family. The risks involved in these relationships were significant for both parties. Federal contacts who became involved with the family faced potential exposure that could destroy their careers and possibly result in criminal prosecution. The family faced the possibility that their federal relationships might be discovered and lead to official investigations that could compromise their entire operation. The management of these risks required sophisticated security procedures and contingency planning. Both parties had developed methods for communicating and conducting business that minimized the possibility of detection while maintaining the effectiveness of their relationship. The effectiveness of their federal relationships was demonstrated by their ability to influence decisions that affected their regional operations. The family had successfully used their federal contacts to redirect government policies, alter regulatory enforcement, and prevent investigations that might otherwise have threatened their security. These federal interventions weren't isolated incidents. They represented systematic efforts to shape government policy in ways that served the family's interests. The family had developed the capability to influence federal decisions with the same effectiveness they had demonstrated in their regional operations. The systematic nature of their federal influence operations suggests that the family had developed long-term strategic objectives that extended far beyond protecting their traditional practices. They appeared to be working toward establishing a permanent and expanding sphere of influence that would eventually encompass national-level decision-making processes. The national-level objectives they were pursuing represented a fundamental expansion of their original mission. What had begun as efforts to protect an isolated mountain community had evolved into a comprehensive program for influencing American society at the highest levels of government and business. This evolution reflected the family's recognition that their traditional isolation was no longer sustainable in an increasingly connected world. They had concluded that their survival required not withdrawal from modern society, but the development of capabilities for controlling and directing that society's development. The control they sought wasn't obvious or direct. It involved subtle influence that would shape decisions and policies in ways that served their interests while appearing to be the result of normal political and economic processes. The family had learned that true power operated through hidden influence rather than visible authority. The hidden nature of their influence was essential to its effectiveness. The family understood that obvious manipulation would create resistance and countermeasures, while subtle influence that appeared to be the result of natural processes would be accepted without question. The acceptance of their influence without question was crucial to their long-term success. The family needed to create conditions where their preferred outcomes would be chosen, not because they had been imposed, but because they appeared to be the natural and logical result of normal decision-making processes. The natural appearance of their preferred outcomes required sophisticated understanding of how decisions were made in the organizations and institutions they sought to influence. The family had developed expertise in identifying the factors that influenced decision-making processes and learning to manipulate those factors in ways that produced desired results. This expertise in decision manipulation had been refined through generations of practice in their regional operations. The family had learned through experience what techniques were most effective for influencing different types of individuals and organizations, and they had developed systematic approaches for applying those techniques. The systematic approaches they had developed could be adapted to different contexts and objectives, making them effective tools for expanding their influence into new areas. The family had created a toolkit of influence techniques that could be applied wherever they encountered decision making processes that affected their interests. The toolkit they had developed included methods for identifying key decision makers, assessing their vulnerabilities and motivations, and developing approaches for influencing their decisions in subtle but effective ways. These methods had been tested and refined through extensive practice, making them reliable tools for achieving influence objectives. The reliability of their influence methods was demonstrated by their consistent success in achieving their objectives across multiple contexts and time periods. The family had developed capabilities that produced predictable results when applied properly, giving them confidence in their ability to influence events according to their strategic plans. The strategic plans they had developed for expanding their influence were comprehensive and long-term, involving multiple phases of activity designed to achieve progressively more ambitious objectives. These plans reflected sophisticated understanding of how power operated in American society and how it could be acquired and exercised effectively. The phases of their expansion plans were designed to build upon each other, with each phase creating the foundation for more ambitious activities in subsequent phases. The family had learned that sustainable influence required gradual development rather than rapid expansion that might attract unwanted attention. The gradual development approach they had adopted allowed them to test and refine their techniques while building the relationships and capabilities necessary for more ambitious operations. This approach also provided opportunities to identify and address potential vulnerabilities before they could become serious problems. The identification and addressing of vulnerabilities was an ongoing process that involved continuous assessment of their operations and security procedures. The family had learned that maintaining security required constant vigilance and adaptation to changing circumstances and new threats. The constant vigilance they maintained involved multiple layers of monitoring and assessment that provided early warning about potential problems. Those systems allowed them to identify and respond to threats before they could develop into serious challenges to their security or operations. The response capabilities they had developed were both comprehensive and flexible, allowing them to address different types of threats using appropriate methods and resources. The family had learned to match their responses to the specific nature of each threat, avoiding both insufficient responses that might fail to eliminate problems and excessive responses that might create new vulnerabilities. The matching of responses to threats required sophisticated assessment capabilities that could accurately evaluate the nature and severity of different types of challenges. The family had developed expertise in threat assessment that allowed them to make informed decisions about how to respond to potential problems. This threat assessment expertise was continuously updated and refined based on experience with new types of challenges and changes in the environment in which they operated. The family understood that effective security required continuous learning and adaptation to maintain effectiveness against evolving threats. The continuous learning and adaptation they practiced had enabled them to maintain their security and expand their influence despite operating in an increasingly complex and challenging environment. Their success demonstrated that even the most sophisticated security systems could be defeated by organizations that were sufficiently committed to developing and maintaining superior capabilities. The superior capabilities they had developed were the result of systematic investment in building organizational strengths that would provide lasting advantages in their conflicts with potential adversaries. The family had recognized that their long term success required capabilities that exceeded those of any organization that might oppose them. The organizational strengths they had built included not just operational capabilities, but also the cultural and psychological foundations that enabled them to maintain their effectiveness across multiple generations. They had created a system that could preserve and transmit essential knowledge and capabilities while also adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The system they had created for preserving and transmitting their capabilities was both robust and flexible, ensuring that essential knowledge would be maintained even if individual members were lost, while also allowing for innovation and improvement. This system had enabled them to maintain their effectiveness while expanding their operations across multiple generations. The effectiveness they had maintained across multiple generations was demonstrated by their ability to achieve increasingly ambitious objectives while preserving their security and organizational integrity. The family had proven that traditional organizational structures could be adapted to operate effectively in modern environments without losing their essential characteristics. The adaptation they had achieved while preserving their essential characteristics represented a remarkable organizational accomplishment that challenged common assumptions about the limitations of traditional family based organizations. They had demonstrated that such organizations could develop capabilities that rivaled or exceeded those of modern institutions while maintaining the loyalty and commitment that came from traditional family bonds. The loyalty and commitment that characterized their organization were both strengths and potential vulnerabilities. These characteristics enabled them to maintain security and achieve objectives that would be impossible for less cohesive organizations, but they also created dependencies and rigidities that might become problematic if circumstances changed dramatically. The potential vulnerabilities created by their organizational characteristics were balanced by the advantages they provided in terms of security, effectiveness, and sustainability. The family had concluded that the benefits of their traditional structure outweighed the risks, and they had developed methods for managing those risks while preserving the advantages. The methods they had developed for managing organizational risks while preserving advantages reflected sophisticated understanding of organizational dynamics and human psychology. They had learned to maintain the positive aspects of their traditional structure while adapting to modern requirements and challenges. This balance between tradition and adaptation had enabled them to create an organization that was both deeply rooted in historical practices and highly effective in contemporary environments. The family had achieved a synthesis that preserved their essential identity while developing the capabilities necessary for success in an increasingly complex world. The synthesis they had achieved between tradition and modernity represented more than just organizational adaptation. It demonstrated a fundamental understanding of how to preserve essential values while developing new capabilities. This understanding had enabled them to maintain their cultural identity while building an organization that could compete effectively with modern institutions. The cultural identity they had preserved while building modern capabilities provided both motivation and direction for their activities. The family understood that their traditional practices and values were not obstacles to be overcome, but sources of strength that could be enhanced through careful integration with contemporary methods and technologies. The integration of traditional values with contemporary methods had produced an organization that was both unique and highly effective. The family had created something that was neither purely traditional nor purely modern, but a hybrid that combined the best aspects of both approaches. This hybrid approach to organization had enabled them to achieve objectives that would have been impossible using either traditional or modern methods alone. The family had demonstrated that creative synthesis could produce capabilities that exceeded those available through conventional approaches. The creative synthesis they had achieved was the result of generations of experimentation and refinement. The family had learned through experience what combinations of traditional and modern approaches were most effective for achieving their objectives while maintaining their security and organizational integrity. The experimentation and refinement process they had undertaken had produced an organization that was both highly effective and remarkably resilient. The family had created a system that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential characteristics and capabilities. The resilience they had built into their organizational system was demonstrated by their ability to survive and thrive despite operating in an environment that was increasingly hostile to traditional practices and secretive organizations. They had proven that even the most sophisticated modern surveillance and investigation capabilities could be defeated by organizations that were sufficiently committed to developing superior countermeasures. The countermeasures they had developed against modern surveillance and investigation were comprehensive and continuously updated to address new threats and capabilities. The family had invested heavily in understanding and defeating the methods used by their potential adversaries, creating defensive capabilities that exceeded anything their opponents possessed. The investment they had made in developing superior defensive capabilities reflected their understanding that their survival depended on maintaining advantages that would enable them to defeat any organization that might oppose them. They had recognized that passive defense was insufficient and had developed active countermeasures that could neutralize threats before they could become serious problems. The active countermeasures they had developed were both sophisticated and effective, enabling them to eliminate threats while maintaining their security and avoiding detection. The family had created capabilities that allowed them to take preemptive action against potential adversaries while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. The plausible deniability they maintained was essential to their security because it prevented their adversaries from developing effective countermeasures. The family understood that their opponents could not respond effectively to threats they could not identify or prove, and they had structured their operations to maintain this advantage. The structural advantages they had built into their operations were the result of careful planning and systematic development over multiple generations. The family had created systems that provided multiple layers of protection while also enabling them to achieve increasingly ambitious objectives. The ambitious objectives they were pursuing represented a fundamental expansion of their original mission and capabilities. What had begun as efforts to protect an isolated mountain community had evolved into a comprehensive program for influencing American society at the highest levels of government and business. But the true scope of their ambitions would only become clear through examination of the final phase of their expansion plans, objectives that would challenge everything Americans believed about the nature of power and influence in their society. The final phase of their expansion plans involved objectives that would have seemed impossible to their mountain ancestors, yet represented the logical culmination of everything they had been building toward for generations. The family had recognized that true security in the modern world required more than regional influence or even national level connections. It demanded the ability to shape the fundamental structures that governed American society. Their ultimate objective was nothing less than the creation of a parallel system of governance that would operate alongside but separate from official government institutions. This system would possess the capability to influence or override official decisions when necessary, while maintaining the appearance of democratic legitimacy. The family had concluded that only by achieving this level of control could they ensure their practices would continue uninterrupted, regardless of political changes or social developments. The parallel governance system they envisioned would operate through networks of carefully positioned individuals who shared their commitment to traditional values and methods. These individuals would be placed in key positions throughout government, business, and social institutions, creating a hidden infrastructure of influence that could coordinate actions across multiple sectors simultaneously. The coordination of actions across multiple sectors required communication systems that could operate without detection by official surveillance capabilities. The family had developed methods for secure communication that combined traditional techniques with modern technology, creating systems that were both effective and virtually impossible to intercept or decode. These communication systems enabled them to coordinate complex operations involving multiple participants across broad geographic areas. The family could issue instructions, receive reports, and manage resources with the efficiency of a modern corporation while maintaining the security of a traditional secret society. The efficiency they had achieved in managing their operations was demonstrated by their ability to respond rapidly to changing circumstances and emerging opportunities. The family had created decision-making processes that could evaluate situations and implement responses faster than most official organizations, giving them significant advantages in competitive situations. Their competitive advantages were enhanced by their willingness to use methods that official organizations could not or would not employ. The family operated without the legal and ethical constraints that limited their opponents, giving them flexibility that often proved decisive in achieving their objectives. The flexibility they possessed in choosing methods and approaches allowed them to adapt their tactics to specific situations and opponents. The family had learned to match their responses to the vulnerabilities and limitations of their adversaries, ensuring that their actions would be both effective and difficult to counter. The difficulty of countering their actions was increased by their ability to operate simultaneously through multiple channels and approaches. The family could pursue the same objective through several different methods, ensuring that the failure of any single approach would not compromise their overall success. This redundancy in their operational approaches reflected their understanding that complex objectives required multiple pathways to success. The family had learned that relying on single methods or approaches created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sophisticated opponents. The sophisticated opponents they faced in their expansion efforts included government agencies, corporate security organizations, and academic researchers who possessed capabilities that exceeded anything their ancestors had encountered. The family had recognized that success against such opponents required equally sophisticated countermeasures and strategies. The strategies they had developed for dealing with sophisticated opponents involved comprehensive intelligence operations that provided detailed information about their adversaries' capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. This intelligence enabled them to anticipate and counter their opponents' actions while maintaining their own security. The intelligence operations they conducted were both extensive and sophisticated, involving multiple sources and collection methods that provided comprehensive coverage of their areas of interest. The family had developed capabilities for gathering information that rivaled those of professional intelligence agencies while maintaining better security and operational discipline. The operational discipline they maintained was essential to their success because it prevented the kinds of mistakes that could compromise their security or reveal their activities to their opponents. The family had learned through experience that even small errors could have catastrophic consequences when dealing with sophisticated adversaries. The catastrophic consequences they sought to avoid included not just exposure of their current activities, but potential revelation of their historical practices and the full scope of their influence network. The family understood that any significant security breach could unravel decades of careful work and expose them to retaliation from numerous enemies. The retaliation they might face from exposed enemies was a constant consideration in their planning and operations. The family had developed contingency plans for dealing with various scenarios involving partial or complete exposure of their activities, including methods for protecting their members and preserving their essential capabilities. The protection of their members in crisis situations involved both physical security measures and legal strategies that could minimize the consequences of exposure. The family had invested in developing relationships with legal professionals who could provide effective representation while maintaining appropriate discretion about their clients' activities. The legal strategies they had developed were designed to exploit the complexities and limitations of the American legal system. The family had learned to use legal procedures and requirements in ways that protected their interests while creating obstacles for their opponents. The obstacles they could create for their opponents included procedural delays, jurisdictional complications, and evidentiary challenges that made successful prosecution difficult or impossible. The family had developed expertise in legal manipulation that enabled them to avoid consequences even when their activities were discovered. The legal manipulation they practiced was complemented by their ability to influence the selection and behavior of judges, prosecutors, and other legal officials. The family had developed methods for effecting legal proceedings that went far beyond simple corruption or bribery. Their influence on legal proceedings involved sophisticated understanding of how legal decisions were made and what factors influenced the individuals who made those decisions. The family had learned to identify and exploit the personal and professional vulnerabilities of legal officials in ways that produced favorable outcomes. The favorable outcomes they achieved in legal proceedings were crucial to their ability to operate with impunity despite the illegal nature of many of their activities. The family had created a system that provided effective immunity from legal consequences while maintaining the appearance of operating within the law. The appearance of legal operation was essential to their public image and their ability to maintain relationships with legitimate organizations and individuals. The family understood that obvious criminality would create resistance and countermeasures that would interfere with their long-term objectives. The long-term objectives they were pursuing required sustained cooperation from individuals and organizations that would refuse to participate in obviously illegal activities. The family had learned to present their activities in ways that made participation seem reasonable and legitimate to potential allies. The presentation of their activities as legitimate involved sophisticated public relations and information management techniques that shaped how their actions were perceived by different audiences. The family had developed expertise in controlling narratives and managing perceptions that rivaled that of professional public relations firms. The narrative control they exercised extended beyond simple propaganda to include systematic manipulation of information sources and communication channels. The family had developed capabilities for influencing how information was gathered, processed, and disseminated across multiple media platforms and communication networks. The influence they exercised over information systems enabled them to shape public understanding of events and issues in ways that served their interests. The family could promote favorable interpretations of their activities while suppressing or discrediting unfavorable coverage. The suppression of unfavorable coverage involved both direct intervention with media organizations and more subtle methods for influencing editorial decisions and reporting priorities. The family had learned to affect media coverage without leaving obvious traces of their involvement. The subtle methods they used for influencing media coverage were more effective than direct censorship because they created the appearance of independent editorial judgment while actually serving the family's interests. This approach avoided the resistance that obvious manipulation would generate while achieving the same practical results. The practical results they achieved through media influence included shaping public opinion about issues that affected their interests and creating favorable conditions for their operations. The family had learned to use media influence as a tool for environmental manipulation that supported their other activities. The environmental manipulation they practiced through media influence was part of a broader strategy for shaping social and political conditions in ways that favored their objectives. The family had developed capabilities for influencing multiple aspects of the social environment simultaneously. The simultaneous influence they exercised over multiple aspects of the social environment created synergistic effects that amplified their power beyond what would be possible through individual interventions. The family had learned to coordinate their activities across different domains to achieve maximum impact. The maximum impact they sought through coordinated activities involved fundamental changes in how American society operated. The family was working to create conditions where their values and methods would be accepted as normal and legitimate rather than exceptional or criminal. The normalization of their values and methods was a long-term project that required gradual changes in social attitudes and institutional practices. The family had developed strategies for promoting these changes that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness for most people. The unconscious influence they exercised over social attitudes was achieved through systematic manipulation of cultural symbols, narratives, and experiences that shaped how people understood their world. The family had learned to affect fundamental beliefs and assumptions in ways that supported their objectives. The fundamental beliefs and assumptions they sought to influence included ideas about authority, tradition, community, and individual responsibility. The family was working to promote interpretations of these concepts that would create favorable conditions for their activities and objectives. The favorable conditions they were creating through cultural influence would enable them to operate more openly while maintaining public support, or at least acceptance. The family had recognized that their ultimate security required social legitimacy rather than just operational secrecy. The social legitimacy they sought would provide protection that exceeded anything they could achieve through secrecy alone. The family understood that truly effective power operated through consent and cooperation rather than force and manipulation. The consent and cooperation they were working to achieve would enable them to accomplish objectives that would be impossible through coercion or deception. The family had learned that sustainable influence required genuine support from the people they sought to lead. The genuine support they were cultivating involved more than just passive acceptance of their authority. The family was working to create active enthusiasm for their vision of how society should be organized and governed. The enthusiasm they sought to generate was based on their ability to provide benefits and services that people valued more than the freedoms and protections they might have to sacrifice. The family had learned to make their authority seem beneficial rather than oppressive. The beneficial nature of their authority was demonstrated through their ability to solve problems and provide services that official institutions could not or would not provide. The family had developed capabilities that enabled them to offer genuine value to people who accepted their leadership. The genuine value they provided included protection from various threats, access to resources and opportunities, and resolution of conflicts that might otherwise remain unresolved. The family had learned to make themselves indispensable to the communities they sought to control. The indispensability they had achieved in their regional operations provided a model for their national expansion efforts. The family was working to replicate their regional success on a national scale by providing similar benefits and services to broader populations. The national replication of their regional success required scaling up their operations while maintaining the effectiveness and security that had characterized their smaller scale activities. The family had developed methods for managing this expansion that preserved their essential capabilities while extending their reach. The preservation of their essential capabilities during expansion was achieved through systematic duplication of their organizational structures and processes. The family had learned to create self-contained units that could operate independently while maintaining coordination with the broader organization. The independent operation of self-contained units provided both security and flexibility for their expanded operations. The family could continue functioning even if individual units were compromised, and they could adapt their activities to local conditions without compromising their overall objectives. The local adaptation of their activities was crucial to their success in diverse environments because it enabled them to work with existing social structures and cultural patterns rather than against them. The family had learned to modify their approaches to fit different contexts while maintaining their core objectives. The core objectives they maintained across different contexts involved establishing their authority and implementing their values, regardless of local variations in methods or presentation. The family was committed to achieving the same fundamental outcomes, even when the specific techniques required adaptation. The fundamental outcomes they sought in all their operations included the establishment of hierarchical social structures that recognized their authority and the implementation of traditional practices that preserved their cultural identity. These outcomes were non-negotiable regardless of local circumstances. The non-negotiable nature of their fundamental objectives created potential conflicts with democratic values and institutions that emphasized individual rights and popular sovereignty. The family had developed strategies for managing these conflicts that avoided direct confrontation while achieving their objectives. The avoidance of direct confrontation was essential to their success because it prevented the mobilization of opposition that might otherwise develop if their true objectives became apparent. The family had learned to achieve their goals through indirect methods that avoided triggering resistance. The indirect methods they used to achieve their goals were often more effective than direct approaches because they worked with rather than against existing social and political processes. The family had learned to use established institutions and procedures as tools for implementing their agenda. The use of established institutions as tools for implementing their agenda required sophisticated understanding of how those institutions operated and what factors influenced their decisions. The family had developed expertise in institutional manipulation that enabled them to achieve their objectives through apparently legitimate processes. The apparently legitimate processes they used to achieve their objectives provided cover for activities that might otherwise be recognized as subversive or illegal. The family had learned to use the forms and procedures of democratic governance to implement fundamentally undemocratic objectives. The undemocratic objectives they were pursuing through democratic processes represented a fundamental challenge to American political institutions and values. The family was working to transform American society in ways that would eliminate the democratic accountability and individual freedoms that had traditionally characterized the American system. The elimination of democratic accountability and individual freedoms was being accomplished gradually through a series of changes that individually seemed reasonable but collectively transformed the nature of American governance. The family had learned to use incremental change to achieve revolutionary objectives. The revolutionary objectives they were pursuing through incremental change would ultimately create a society that was fundamentally different from what Americans had traditionally expected. The family was working to establish a system that would preserve their values and practices while eliminating the democratic institutions that might otherwise challenge their authority. The challenge to their authority, represented by democratic institutions, was something the family had recognized as their ultimate enemy. They understood that genuine democracy was incompatible with the kind of hierarchical, traditional society they sought to create and maintain. The incompatibility between democracy and their traditional society meant that one or the other would have to be eliminated. The family had chosen to work toward the elimination of democratic institutions rather than abandon their traditional practices and values. The elimination of democratic institutions was being accomplished through a combination of direct subversion and indirect influence that gradually reduced the effectiveness of democratic processes. The family was working to make democracy ineffective rather than obviously destroyed. The ineffectiveness of democratic processes was being created through systematic manipulation of electoral systems, legislative procedures, and judicial processes that prevented democratic institutions from responding effectively to popular will. The family had learned to use the complexity of modern governance to frustrate democratic accountability. The frustration of democratic accountability was achieved through the creation of alternative power structures that could override or ignore democratic decisions when necessary. The family was building systems that would enable them to maintain control regardless of electoral outcomes or popular opinion. The maintenance of control, regardless of popular opinion, was essential to their long-term success because it ensured that their authority would not be subject to the changing preferences of democratic majorities. The family had learned that sustainable power required independence from popular approval. The independence from popular approval they were achieving through their alternative power structures provided the foundation for implementing policies and practices that might otherwise be rejected by democratic processes. The family could pursue their objectives without concern for popular resistance. The absence of concern for popular resistance reflected their fundamental rejection of democratic values and their commitment to traditional hierarchical authority. The family believed that their superior wisdom and moral authority justified their right to rule regardless of popular preferences. The superior wisdom and moral authority they claimed were based on their preservation of traditional practices and values that they believed were essential to social stability and cultural continuity. The family saw themselves as guardians of civilization against the corrupting influences of modern democracy. The corrupting influences of modern democracy, in their view, included individualism, egalitarianism, and secularism that threatened the traditional hierarchical order they sought to preserve. The family was working to reverse these influences and restore what they considered the natural order of society. The natural order of society they sought to restore was one in which authority was based on traditional qualifications rather than popular approval, where social roles were determined by birth and custom rather than individual choice, and where community values took precedence over individual rights. The precedence of community values over individual rights was a fundamental principle that guided all their activities. The family believed that individual freedoms had to be subordinated to collective needs as defined by traditional authority structures. The traditional authority structures they sought to restore were based on principles that had guided human societies for millennia before the development of modern democratic institutions. The family saw themselves as continuing an ancient tradition that had been disrupted by recent historical developments. The recent historical developments they sought to reverse included the democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution, and the social changes of the 20th century. The family was working to restore pre-modern social structures adapted to contemporary conditions. The adaptation of pre-modern social structures to contemporary conditions required sophisticated understanding of both traditional principles and modern realities. The family had developed methods for implementing ancient wisdom using modern tools and techniques. The implementation of ancient wisdom using modern tools represented the culmination of their evolutionary process. The family had learned to combine the best aspects of traditional and modern approaches to create systems that were both effective and authentic to their values. The authenticity to their values was essential to their sense of identity and purpose. The family understood that their ultimate success would be measured not just by their ability to achieve power, but by their success in preserving and transmitting the traditions that defined their existence. The preservation and transmission of their traditions required more than just maintaining their practices within their own community. The family had recognized that their traditions could only survive if they became the organizing principles for the broader society in which they lived. The transformation of broader society according to their traditional principles represented their ultimate objective. The family was working to create a world where their values and practices would be recognized as the foundation for social order and cultural continuity. The recognition of their values and practices as the foundation for social order would provide the legitimacy they needed to operate openly while maintaining their essential characteristics. The family had learned that true power required social acceptance rather than just operational effectiveness. The social acceptance they sought would enable them to abandon the secrecy that had protected them while also limiting their influence. The family was working toward a future where their authority would be openly acknowledged and their practices publicly celebrated. The public celebration of their practices would represent the ultimate vindication of their long struggle to preserve traditional values against the pressures of modern society. The family had endured generations of secrecy and isolation to reach this moment of potential triumph. The potential triumph they were approaching represented more than just personal success. It would validate their belief that traditional wisdom could prevail against modern confusion and corruption. The family saw their success as a victory for all who valued stability, hierarchy, and cultural continuity. The victory they sought would not just restore their own traditions, but would provide a model for other communities and societies that had lost their way in the chaos of modern democracy. The family believed their success would inspire a broader return to traditional values and practices. The broader return to traditional values they hoped to inspire would create a world where their own practices would seem normal rather than exceptional. The family was working to normalize their approach to social organization and cultural preservation. The normalization of their approach would eliminate the need for the elaborate secrecy and security measures that had characterized their operations for generations. The family looked forward to a time when their children could practice their traditions openly without fear of persecution or interference. The elimination of fear and persecution would allow them to focus entirely on the positive aspects of their traditions rather than the defensive measures that had consumed so much of their energy. The family anticipated a future where their practices would be sources of pride rather than secrets to be hidden. The transformation from secrecy to pride would represent the ultimate success of their long-term strategy. The family had endured generations of hardship and sacrifice to achieve the conditions where their traditions could flourish openly. The open flourishing of their traditions would provide the foundation for expanding their influence even further. The family had learned that success created opportunities for even greater achievements, and they were already planning for the next phase of their development. The next phase of their development would involve extending their influence beyond American borders to create international networks based on their principles. The family had recognized that their ultimate security required global rather than just national influence. The global influence they sought would enable them to create a world where traditional values and hierarchical authority would be recognized as universal principles rather than regional preferences. The family was working toward a future where their approach to social organization would become the international standard. The international standard they hoped to establish would provide permanent security for their traditions and practices. The family understood that their ultimate success would be measured by their ability to create conditions where their values would be preserved for future generations. The preservation of their values for future generations was the ultimate purpose that had motivated their activities across multiple generations. The family had endured centuries of struggle and sacrifice to ensure that their traditions would survive and flourish. The survival and flourishing of their traditions would justify all the hardships they had endured and all the sacrifices they had made. The family had maintained their commitment to their objectives through generations of difficulty because they believed their success would vindicate their ancestors' dedication and sacrifice. The vindication of their ancestors' dedication would provide meaning and purpose that transcended individual achievement. The family understood that their success would honor the memory of all who had contributed to their long struggle while also providing security for future generations. The security for future generations they were working to achieve would ensure that their descendants would never face the challenges and dangers that had characterized their own experience. The family was creating a world where their traditions would be protected and celebrated rather than hidden and defended. The protection and celebration of their traditions would represent the ultimate triumph of their long campaign to preserve traditional values against the forces of modern change. The family had proven that dedication, sacrifice, and strategic thinking could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The seemingly insurmountable obstacles they had overcome included the opposition of democratic institutions, the challenge of modern surveillance capabilities, and the resistance of individuals and organizations that opposed their objectives. The family had learned that persistence and adaptability could defeat any opponent. The defeat of any opponent was possible because the family had developed capabilities that exceeded those of their adversaries while maintaining the unity and commitment that came from shared values and common purpose. They had proven that traditional organizations could compete successfully with modern institutions. The successful competition with modern institutions demonstrated that reports of tradition's death had been greatly exaggerated. The family had shown that ancient wisdom could be adapted to contemporary conditions without losing its essential power and relevance. The essential power and relevance of their ancient wisdom would provide the foundation for their continuing success as they moved forward with their plans for transforming American society. The family had learned that their traditions were not obstacles to overcome, but sources of strength to be cultivated and applied. The cultivation and application of their traditional strengths would enable them to achieve objectives that would have seemed impossible to their ancestors. The family had proven that traditional values and modern capabilities could be combined to create unprecedented power and influence. The unprecedented power and influence they had achieved were now being directed toward their ultimate objective of transforming American society according to their traditional principles. The family was approaching the culmination of generations of planning and preparation. The culmination they were approaching would represent more than just the achievement of their immediate objectives. It would validate their entire approach to preserving traditional values in a modern world. The family was about to demonstrate that their methods and principles could succeed on a national scale. The national scale success they were achieving would provide the foundation for even more ambitious projects that would extend their influence globally. The family had learned that success created opportunities for even greater achievements, and they were already planning for the next phase of their expansion. But perhaps most importantly, their success would ensure that the traditions and practices that had sustained them through generations of struggle would continue to flourish for generations to come. The family had secured not just their own future, but the future of the values and principles they had devoted their lives to preserving. In the end, the story of this family represents more than just an account of hidden influence and secret power. It demonstrates that in America, even in the 21st century, there are still forces operating beyond the reach of democratic accountability, still communities that have learned to thrive by remaining invisible, and still traditions that continue to shape events while remaining unknown to those they affect. The mountains of Appalachia have always been places where the old ways persisted long after they had been abandoned elsewhere. What makes this family's story particularly significant is not just their survival, but their transformation from a defensive community protecting their traditions to an offensive organization working to impose those traditions on the broader society. Their success challenges fundamental assumptions about how power operates in democratic societies and raises disturbing questions about the vulnerability of democratic institutions to patient, sophisticated subversion. The family has demonstrated that traditional authority structures can adapt to modern conditions while maintaining their essential characteristics, and that ancient methods of social control can be enhanced rather than replaced by contemporary technology. Most troubling of all, their story suggests that the transformation of American society may already be further advanced than most people realize. The family's influence has been growing for generations, and their success in remaining hidden while achieving their objectives indicates that other similar organizations may be operating in ways that have yet to be discovered or understood. The silence that still surrounds their activities in the mountains of eastern Kentucky may be just one example of a broader pattern of secrecy that protects influences and powers that most Americans would find disturbing if they were ever fully revealed. In an age when we assume that everything is known and documented, the story of this family reminds us that some secrets are still kept, some powers still operate in darkness, and some traditions still shape our world in ways we are not permitted to see. The true measure of their success may not be what they have achieved, but what they have managed to keep hidden while achieving it. And if their story teaches us anything, it is that in the mountains of Appalachia, the most important truths are often the ones that nobody dares to mention.